Georgia's soil has always been red, but not just from clay. It has drunk blood, tears, and the quiet suffering of those who bent their backs beneath a master's whip. Among them was Ruth, an enslaved mother whose spirit seemed ordinary to the world around her, until grief lit a fire no one could put out. Her story is not written in history books. It was whispered in the quarters, carried on the wind, and remembered in silence by those who knew what she dared to do. For when her only daughter, Sarah, was struck down by cruelty, Ruth chose not to bow her head or pray for justice that never came. She chose fire. This is the tale of a woman who walked in silence, who watched, who learned. A woman who carried molten iron not just in her hands, but in her heart. And when the night came, she poured both upon the one who had mocked her pain. But before the flames rose, Ruth left behind a question that burns even now. When the world denies you justice, how far will a mother go to make the world remember her child? By dawn, when the mist still clung to the red earth and the cicadas sang their hollow song, Ruth bent her back to the rows of cotton. Her hands moved like machinery, plucking white balls until her fingers stung and her palms split open. The overseer's eyes followed her every move, whip coiled like a sleeping snake in his hand. For Ruth, 23 years had passed in chains, yet each day felt like the same eternal hour, labor in the sun, silence in the quarters, and the slow death of hope. The plantation stretched endless across the Georgia countryside, its fields wide enough to swallow a soul whole. From the big house, painted bright against the dirt, Mrs. Catherine's sharp eyes watched through shuttered windows. Ruth had learned long ago that it was not the master's voice she feared most. It was hers. Catherine ruled the house with cruelty carved into every gesture, her lace gowns hiding a heart as cold as iron. When Ruth was summoned indoors, the day's torment only deepened. Catherine had a talent for inventing punishments, floors scrubbed until Ruth's knuckles were raw and bleeding, tables polished until her reflection stared back like a ghost. If a plate was not set perfectly or a corner of the parlor not dusted fine, Catherine's whip hissed through the air, marking Ruth's skin with welts that burned deep into the night. "Clumsy hands make clumsy children," Catherine spat one evening when Ruth faltered with a porcelain vase. "Perhaps I should sell your girl before she grows to be the same." Those words carved deeper than any lash. Sarah, Ruth's daughter, barely 8, delicate as a wildflower, was the tether that kept her mother breathing. Sarah's laughter was soft, rare as a hymn sung in chains. She had wide eyes, bright with curiosity, but already shadowed by fear. Catherine despised the child, not because of her disobedience, but because she reminded Ruth of something she could never crush: love. Ruth lived in terror of the mistress's threats. The slave market in Savannah was always hungry. One wagon ride, one signature on a slip of paper, and Sarah would vanish into a world worse than death. Catherine made sure Ruth never forgot this, dangling her daughter's fate like a noose. By day, Ruth worked under the eye of the overseer. By night, she endured Catherine's endless demands, scrubbing floors on her knees until blood stained the wood, hauling buckets of water up steep stairs while the mistress lounged with her brandy. When Ruth's arms shook with exhaustion, Catherine laughed. "If you tire, I'll have the girl carry the buckets. She's strong enough to serve." Sometimes Ruth caught glimpses of Sarah in the quarters, the child sitting by the fire, small hands clutched around a rag doll made from scraps of cloth. Ruth would kneel and whisper stolen lullabies, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead, but always with an ear straining for Catherine's footsteps. The bond between mother and child was tender but fragile, each embrace stolen like contraband. One evening, after a day of endless toil, Ruth returned to the big house to find Catherine waiting. A whip hung from her mistress's hand, tapping against her palm. The air smelled of wax and smoke. "You lingered too long in the quarters," Catherine accused, though Ruth had returned the moment she was called. "Do you think I don't see your defiance? Do you think I don't know where your loyalties lie?" Ruth bowed her head, silent, the old instinct of survival forcing her lips closed. Catherine stepped closer, her perfume sharp, her voice venomous. "You should remember, Ruth. Your child is not yours. She belongs to me. Her fate rests on how well you please me." That night, Ruth lay awake on the thin straw pallet, body aching, mind burning. Sarah's face floated before her, fragile, innocent, at risk every hour. Ruth had endured beatings, insults, hunger, exhaustion. But the thought of losing Sarah was the one wound that could kill her spirit entirely. She curled around her daughter, whispering into her hair, "Hush, baby. Mama's here. Mama won't let them take you." Still, Ruth knew her words were only half-truths. On this soil under Catherine's roof, nothing was hers to keep. The weeks bled together, marked by the crack of the whip, the weight of the hoe, the sting of scalding water on her hands as she scrubbed. Ruth's body grew thin, her back bowed, but her eyes stayed fierce. In them burned a quiet strength that Catherine could not see, or perhaps chose not to. That strength was not rebellion, not yet, but the kind of endurance that made survival possible. Neighbors whispered that Catherine's cruelty outstripped her husband's, though they never dared to say it aloud. She found satisfaction not in work, but in torment. "A slave must be reminded daily of her place," Catherine would say, sipping her brandy as if quoting scripture. "Otherwise, she begins to imagine herself human." One rainy afternoon, Catherine forced Ruth to kneel on the parlor floor and scrub mud from the boots of guests. Each stroke of the brush tore her skin open, but Ruth kept her head down. Sarah stood nearby, forced to watch. When Ruth faltered, Catherine leaned toward the girl. "See how your mother bleeds for me. If she fails, you will too." The child's eyes filled with tears, and Ruth's heart clenched. She wanted to scream, to rise and strike Catherine down, but silence was her only weapon. Rage burned deep, banked like embers, waiting. The section closes with Ruth alone in the night, gazing out at the vast Georgia fields under a blood-red sunset. Her body is chained by the lash and the command of her mistress, but her soul whispers silently against the wind one day. The evening began like any other, with Catherine's voice slicing through the halls of the big house. The mistress's commands echoed like a lash in the air: "Sweep here, polish there, fetch the silver from the chest." Ruth bent to each order with the same bowed head, each movement heavy with exhaustion. Sarah, standing silently in the corner, clutched her rag doll to her chest, her small body nearly swallowed by the dim lamplight. Catherine's eyes slid to the child, sharp as a blade. "Speak when spoken to, girl," she snapped. But Sarah, no longer able to stay silent under her mother's torment, whispered something soft, a plea to leave her mother alone. The room went still. Catherine's face hardened. Then, with a suddenness that cracked the silence, her hand shot out and struck Sarah across the mouth. The child's body crumpled, rag doll tumbling to the floor. A stunned gasp escaped Ruth's lips, sharp and broken. Sarah's cough followed, wet, rattling, edged with red. Blood flecked her lips as she tried to rise. The blow had opened something fragile inside her, something that could not heal. Ruth lunged forward, arms outstretched, but Catherine was quicker. She seized a switch from the mantel and brought it across Ruth's back with practiced cruelty. The crack of wood against flesh filled the parlor. "Stay in your place," Catherine shrieked. "You will not teach your child insolence." Ruth's screams filled the air, desperate and raw, until another lash drove her to silence. She knelt on the floor, clutching her ribs, eyes locked on her daughter's trembling body. Later, when the other house servants carried Sarah to a narrow bed in the corner chamber, Catherine stood in the doorway, arms folded as though surveying livestock. "Tend to her if you wish," she said coldly. "But know this, slaves breed more children. You'll cry over one, and another will come." Her words twisted like iron in Ruth's chest. She wanted to claw at the mistress's face, to rip the smugness from her lips, but the overseer's shadow loomed behind her. Survival forced Ruth still. Hours blurred into days. Ruth stayed by her daughter's bedside, damp cloth in hand, whispering old lullabies through cracked lips. Sarah's skin grew pale, her breathing shallow. Each cough rattled her body as if the life were being torn from her chest thread by thread. "Hold on, baby," Ruth whispered again and again, rocking her gently, though her own body trembled with exhaustion. "Mama's here. Mama won't let go." But the fever deepened, sweat soaking the child's thin shift. The plantation doctor came once, glanced at her with disdain, and left muttering about wasted time. To Catherine, it was of no concern. The girl will either mend or die, makes no difference. At night, Ruth prayed in silence, her voice too broken to carry beyond her lips. She begged for mercy, for strength, for the chance to keep her child alive. But in the dark hours before dawn, Sarah's small hand gripped hers weakly, then loosened. Her chest rose once, then stilled. Ruth froze, waiting for the next breath, but it never came. The world collapsed into silence, a silence heavier than any lash, darker than the deepest night. She gathered Sarah's body into her arms, rocking her as though motion could call her back. Tears streamed down Ruth's face, soaking her daughter's hair. "My baby," she whispered, voice breaking into jagged pieces. "My sweet baby." Catherine's steps clicked across the floor behind her. The mistress's voice carried no softness, no pause. "Enough. Wipe your face. Tears don't change what's done. You'll breed another soon enough." That sentence snapped something inside Ruth, not like a twig breaking, but like iron cooling to stone. Her tears slowed, her rocking ceased. She pressed one last kiss to Sarah's brow, then laid her child gently upon the bed. She rose, eyes dry, voice silent. The overseer waiting outside saw no wailing mother now, only a woman made hollow. But within that hollow, something dangerous stirred. In the days that followed, Ruth no longer wept. She moved like a shadow, her hands steady, her face expressionless. Catherine believed she had broken her slave, mistaking silence for submission. What she did not see was Ruth's eyes, how they lingered on the iron pots in the kitchen, the blacksmith's shed where molten metal hissed and steamed, the routines of the house at night. Ruth memorized the patterns when Catherine retired to her chamber, how long the servants lingered in the kitchen, the rhythm of the master's snores. She watched the forge with new intent, seeing not tools of labor, but instruments of fire and death. Her grief did not vanish, it transformed. Where sorrow had been, resolve now took root. Sarah's death had stripped Ruth of fear, leaving behind a heart that no longer beat for survival alone. Each step she took across the plantation was heavy with purpose. Each breath she drew carried the echo of her daughter's last. She began to whisper Sarah's name not as a plea, but as a promise that Catherine would answer for every lash, every insult, every drop of blood. Ruth was no longer merely enduring. She was plotting. The weeks after Sarah's death hollowed Ruth into something unrecognizable, at least to Catherine. To the mistress, the silence looked like surrender. Ruth no longer argued, never cried, and barely lifted her eyes. When Catherine barked a command, Ruth obeyed with quiet precision, her voice flat, her movements steady. "She's learned at last," Catherine remarked smugly one evening, sipping her brandy as Ruth scrubbed the parlor floor. "Grief makes a better servant than fear." What Catherine did not see was the ember burning beneath the silence. Ruth's grief had not dulled her, it had sharpened her. Every bowed head, every muted response was camouflage. She had become a shadow of obedience so she might learn to move unseen. During daylight hours, she performed her tasks with mechanical rhythm. But when errands carried her near the smithy, Ruth's eyes drank in everything. The blacksmith's shed lay at the far edge of the plantation, a place where enslaved men hammered iron into plows, horseshoes, and chains. The heat there was suffocating, flames roaring against the stone hearth, sparks leaping like fireflies. To most, it was only a workshop of toil. To Ruth, it became a temple of possibility. She watched the men pour molten iron into molds, their arms steady as they guided the glowing liquid. She studied the ladles, long-handled, heavy, designed to carry heat that could melt flesh to bone. She noted how long the fire had to be stoked before the iron softened, how the bellows fed the flames until they roared like a living beast. When the men's eyes were turned, Ruth lingered. She pretended to fetch water, to wipe a table, to carry rags. But her gaze followed every step: how to lift the ladle without spilling, how to balance the weight, how to pour with precision. She memorized the way the iron hissed when it met air, the way smoke curled upward like the ghost of something dying. Each time she walked away, her body trembled with equal parts fear and hunger. She was playing with knowledge forbidden to her, knowledge that could mean death if discovered. Yet she clutched it close, letting it fuse with the ache in her chest. At night in the quarters, she hummed lullabies to herself, songs once meant for Sarah. The notes were softer now, sorrow clinging to every syllable. But as the melodies lingered, Ruth's grief hardened into resolve. She whispered her daughter's name like an oath. Each word carried her closer to the fire. One stormy night, the rain came down in sheets, hammering the roof of the big house. The guests who had gathered for supper lingered in the parlor with brandy, their laughter echoing against the walls. Ruth carried trays between rooms, her body invisible to their eyes, until Catherine's voice rose above the storm. She wept for days like a fool, the mistress told her neighbor, her tone bright with cruel delight. You'd think I'd taken her soul the way she carried on. I told her the truth plain: one dead child is nothing. Slaves breed more. She'll have another to scrub my floors before long. The room erupted in laughter. Glasses clinked, the storm thundered, and Ruth stood in the doorway with her tray, heart pounding. Her nails dug into the wood as her mistress's words seared themselves into her mind. Sarah, reduced to nothing, mocked as though she were less than a breath. Ruth turned, her face blank as always, but inside the ember flared into flame. She returned to the quarters, the storm lashing her skin as if urging her onward. That night, she rose when others slept, walking barefoot through mud to the smithy. The forge glowed even in the rain, embers still alive from the day's work. Ruth entered, her hands trembling as she picked up a rag to shield them. The smell of coal and iron filled her lungs, acrid and heavy. She approached the hearth, staring into the orange glow where iron softened into liquid fire. The blacksmiths had left behind half-filled molds and a ladle propped against the wall. Ruth touched the handle. It was heavier than she expected, cold iron slick with soot. She lifted it, balancing the weight in both hands, imagining the molten metal sloshing inside. She pictured Catherine's face, smug and cruel, twisted with laughter. She saw her lying in bed, silk sheets drawn high, believing herself untouchable. Ruth's lips moved, barely audible above the storm. "You took my child, I will take your life." The words did not tremble. They rang steady, low, certain. The forge seemed to answer her, hissing as rain slipped through cracks in the roof, striking coals and vanishing in steam. From that night on, Ruth's visits to the smithy became ritual. She studied how to control the fire, how to keep her steps steady while carrying heat that could melt the world. She timed her movements, imagining the path from forge to chamber, the way her hands would grip the ladle, the moment the iron would pour. In the big house, Catherine grew more careless, mistaking Ruth's silence for submission. She scolded less, laughed more, believing her cruelty had cowed the woman she tormented. What she could not see was how Ruth's eyes, always lowered, gleamed like coals beneath ash. The plantation slumbered, unaware that vengeance was taking shape in the dark. Each day Ruth endured, each night she prepared. Grief had forged her into something unbreakable, and in the fire of the forge she found her weapon. The ember was no longer hidden. It was waiting. Night fell heavy over the plantation, pressing the world into silence. The cicadas had quieted, the overseer's boots no longer echoed across the yard, and the great house loomed against the storm-dark sky like a sentinel of cruelty. Within, Catherine moved through her evening ritual, sipping her final glass of brandy, smoothing her silks, dismissing her servants with the air of a queen. Her lips curled in their familiar sneer, satisfied by a day spent bending others to her will. When the lamps were extinguished and the halls grew dim, she retired to her chamber, smug and unguarded. The mistress lay upon her bed of carved wood and linen, her breathing heavy with wine, her cruelty sleeping beside her like a second skin. She believed herself untouchable, guarded by fear and tradition, safe within the fortress of her privilege. But outside, another fire waited. In the smithy, Ruth worked swiftly, her hands steady despite the roar of her heartbeat. The forge had been coaxed to life again, flames devouring the coals until iron within the crucible began to soften, to glow, to melt. She gripped the long-handled ladle, dipping it into the crucible with careful control, the liquid metal shimmering like captured sunlight. When she lifted it free, the molten iron hissed, alive and furious, sloshing with a sound that seemed to whisper of vengeance. The weight nearly pulled her arms down, but Ruth steadied herself. She had practiced this movement in her mind 100 times, and tonight her body obeyed the memory of her resolve. She carried the ladle across the yard, each step silent on the damp earth. The storm had broken earlier in the evening, leaving the ground slick with mud, the air sharp with the smell of rain. It clung to her as she crossed the threshold of the great house, slipping inside with a servant's ease. The corridors stretched before her like veins of shadow. Ruth moved slowly, her breath measured, the hiss of molten iron faint but constant. Every creak of the floorboards threatened to betray her, but no one stirred. The house, lulled into drunken slumber, slept as deeply as its mistress. At last, Ruth reached the chamber door. She pushed it open with her hip, careful not to spill a drop of the liquid death she carried. Inside, Catherine lay sprawled across her bed, the silk sheets tangled at her waist, her chest rising and falling with each steady breath. The moonlight bled through the shutters, silvering her face, softening her features into something almost peaceful. But Ruth saw the truth beneath that mask, the hand that had struck Sarah, the lips that had mocked her grief, the eyes that had watched with delight as she bled on the floor. Ruth stepped closer. The iron hissed, a serpent eager to strike. Her arms trembled under the weight, but her gaze was unblinking. She stood over the bed, staring down at the woman who had shattered her world. In that moment, Ruth felt time stretch thin, as though the world held its breath alongside her. She leaned forward, the ladle tilting. And then, with a motion as sure as destiny, she poured. The molten iron spilled across the mistress's body, a cascade of fire and fury. It struck silk and flesh alike, searing through both in an instant. The sound was unlike anything Ruth had ever heard, a wet, hissing scream as cloth ignited and skin burned. Catherine's eyes flew open, her mouth releasing a shriek that split the night. She thrashed, clawing at the sheets, at her own body, but the iron clung to her like judgment itself. The fire consumed her silks, ate into her flesh, spread across the bed in streaks of orange glow. Smoke filled the chamber, thick and choking, carrying the scent of burning linen and charred flesh. Ruth did not move. She stood tall, the empty ladle hanging from her hands, her face bathed in the orange flicker of the fire she had unleashed. Her eyes reflected the blaze, not with horror, but with the cold steadiness of a woman who had carried grief until it hardened into resolve. Catherine's screams tore through the house, echoing down the halls, waking servants and startling the master from his sleep. Feet pounded against floorboards as others rushed toward the chamber, but Ruth's gaze never wavered. Smoke curled upward, wrapping itself around the rafters like a specter. Catherine's voice, once sharp with command, now broke into sobs, then into gurgled moans. Her limbs slowed, her thrashing weakened, until at last her body stilled beneath the smoldering sheets. The bedchamber was silent save for the crackle of fire and the hiss of cooling iron. Ruth leaned close, her lips parting just enough to release a single word, a name heavy with both love and vengeance. "Sarah!" It was not a scream. It was a whisper, steady and final, a prayer answered not by heaven but by fire. The door burst open behind her, voices shouting, hands grabbing, but Ruth did not turn. She stood over the blackened body of her mistress, her posture unshaken, her eyes still fixed on the ruin she had wrought. The overseer's shouts, the master's curses, the servants' gasps all blurred into meaningless noise. The moment was hers alone. The vengeance was complete. They dragged her away, chains biting into her wrists, the smell of smoke still clinging to her hair. But Ruth felt no fear, no regret. She had given her daughter justice in the only language the mistress understood: pain. As the house filled with chaos, Ruth's figure was led through the halls like a shadow of judgment. Behind her, the great bed smoldered, sheets curled in black ruin, the air thick with the ghost of fire. Catherine's reign had ended not with a whisper of command, but with a scream drowned in molten iron. And Ruth, though bound, walked with the bearing of a woman unbroken. The bedchamber still smoldered when Ruth left it behind. Smoke curled through the halls like a veil, the smell of charred silk and seared flesh following her steps. But she did not flee. She did not run into the fields or vanish into the swamp as others might have. Ruth walked slowly, steadily, her bare feet whispering against the wood, her figure outlined in the glow of dying fire. The front door opened before her, and the night air wrapped around her shoulders like a shroud. The moon hung low, pale and cold, shining upon her as if to witness what she had done. She crossed the yard with a calm that unsettled even the shadows. From the quarters a child stirred, then another. Soon faces peered from doorways and windows, eyes wide as they caught sight of her. Ruth moved past them like an apparition, her hair damp with sweat, her arms streaked with soot. She said nothing, but the story spoke for her. Whispers rose like wind through the quarters. Ruth has done it. She burned the mistress. She lit the fire. Ruth did not deny it. Her silence was a confession, her steady stride a declaration. She lifted her chin as she passed, eyes shining not with triumph but with something deeper: release. For once, the weight of fear was gone. The overseer's horns split the night soon after, shrill and frantic. Men stormed the yard with torches, their shouts echoing against the barns. They found Ruth standing in the open, waiting. She did not resist when they bound her wrists in chains. She did not cry when they struck her down with the butt of a rifle. She rose to her feet again, blood at her temple, and walked where they pushed her. At dawn, they dragged her before the master. His face was pale, fury mingled with fear. The overseers circled like dogs, their voices spitting threats, curses, promises of pain. Catherine's absence clung to the house like a hole in the earth, her authority gone in a single night. They demanded answers. "Why?" the master roared. "What possessed you?" hissed the overseer. Ruth lifted her head. Her lips were split, her body beaten, but her voice rang clear. "Because she killed my child," she said. "Because fire remembers." The words silenced the room. Even the overseers, hardened by cruelty, faltered at the sound of her voice. It was not the scream of rebellion. It was truth, plain and immovable, a truth that left no space for denial. Her punishment was swift. No trial, no defense. The gallows were ordered before noon, the wood erected by men who would not meet her eyes. The plantation murmured, the enslaved whispering in corners, prayers rising like smoke for the woman who had dared to turn grief into fire. They whipped her first, a final act of cruelty, the lash-splitting skin that had known nothing but labor and pain. Yet Ruth did not scream. Each strike only deepened her silence until the overseer himself trembled with unease. When they dragged her toward the gallows, her back was torn and raw, but her eyes burned brighter than the iron she had poured. The quarterfolk gathered in secret, drawn by the sound of hammer on wood. They stood at a distance, pressed behind trees and fences, watching as Ruth was led forward in chains. To them, she did not look broken. She walked with her head held high, every step steady, every breath calm. Some wept quietly, clutching children to their chests. Others whispered her name as though it were a prayer. "Ruth! Ruth! Ruth!" The noose swung in the morning light, stark against the sky, the master's face twisted, seeking to reclaim control, to remind the others of their place. But it was not his voice that lingered in the air. It was Ruth's silence, heavy and unyielding. She stepped onto the platform without falter. The chains rattled, but her posture was unbroken. She looked once at the fields, the rows of cotton stretching endless, the red soil that had drunk the blood of so many. Then she lifted her gaze to the horizon where the sun crept over the trees. No fear touched her eyes, only fire. The rope tightened around her neck, rough against her skin. Still, she whispered one last word, so soft it carried only to those nearest, "Sarah." And then the platform gave way. Her body hung limp, but her spirit did not fall. It rose, carried in whispers across the quarters, etched into memory, sealed into the soil of Georgia itself. Ruth had avenged her daughter. She had struck down cruelty not with pleas or prayers, but with fire. Though punished, though silenced, she would never again be called victim. She was a mother who had answered her child's death with justice, who had turned grief into flame, who had walked to her end unbroken. The final image remained in every witness's mind, Ruth in chains, walking toward the gallows, her eyes brighter than the molten iron she had poured. And the soil of Georgia, which had drunk blood faster than rain, drank once more. But this time, it was not the blood of a victim. It was the blood of a woman who had burned her master's house into legend. What do you think, friends? Was Ruth's vengeance an act of justice, or a mother's grief carried too far? Tell me in the comments how you felt about her final choice. And if Ruth's story struck your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who loves powerful stories, and subscribe so you don't miss the next tale of resilience, revenge, and the voices history tried to silence.